next speaker, Kentaro Toyama, is the W.K. Kellogg Associate Professor of Community Information at the University of Michigan School of Information, a Fellow of the Dalai Lama Center for Ethics and Transformative Values at MIT, and author of Geek Heresy, Rescuing Social Change from the Cult of Technology, which I think is very relevant given the discussion we've just had. Previously, he was a researcher at UC Berkeley and Assistant Managing Director of Microsoft Research India, which he co-founded in 2005. At MSR India, he started the Technology for Emerging Markets Research Group, which conducts interdisciplinary research to understand how the world's poorer communities interact with electronic technology and to invent new ways for technology to support their socioeconomic development. He graduated from Yale with a PhD in computer science and from Harvard with a bachelor's degree in physics. Welcome. We're very pleased you're here.
Thank you, Ambuj, for that introduction, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me. I'm honored to be here. Yes, the last couple of questions were actually a great lead-in. I'll also say that Swami Atmagyanananda's talk was actually a very interesting one for me to see. I know very little about Swami Vivekananda, but you'll find that there is some confluence between the things that I'm going to say and apparently his ideas of education. This entire day was titled Ancient Wisdom in Modern Education. I'm going to start talking about modern education, especially the way that some of our educational leaders see how it should be. So this is a quote from Betsy DeVos, who is our current US Secretary of Education. She says, "One long-term trend that's working in our favor is technology. It seems to me that in the internet age, the tendency to equate education with specific school buildings is going to be greatly diminished." And the undercurrent of what she's saying is basically that with the advent of technology, we will increasingly not require physical schools and so on, because the technology is delivering the information right to each of us through our devices. Some of you may have various political views about Betsy DeVos, but I'll say that this kind of view is actually shared by both parties, at least in the United States. So this is our previous Secretary of Education under President Obama, Arne Duncan, and he says, "Technology is a game changer in the field of education, a game changer we desperately need to both improve achievement for all and increase equity." So you can see leaders of all kinds in education are increasingly turning to technology as a way to solve the challenges that we have in our educational system. Now, my background is in computer science, and I will say that this is a view that I also optimistically held, that I thought there are ways in which technology could support education. I used to work for Microsoft, and in that capacity, I moved to India actually for a little over 5 years to help start a new research lab in that country. And one of the projects that we worked on while we were there was to see whether or not we could use digital technology in some way to support education. And so the first thing we did was to actually visit government schools in rural India to see how they were using technology. Not a lot of schools at that time had computers, but those that did showed you something like this, where you can see there would be several computers in a room, and in this case, a ratio of about 3 children to 1, because they didn't have enough computers for each child. It was not uncommon to see 5 children to 1, or even 9 or 10 children to 1. And in all of these situations, what you would find is that there would be one dominant child, often an upper caste boy, who would grab hold of the mouse and keyboard and kind of elbow his way in, and everybody else would be left out of the interaction. And we saw this situation, and we said, well, this seems like a situation where there's a relatively simple technological solution. And that solution was to give every student a mouse, allow them to plug in as many mice as possible, and then on screen to have games in which it's basically an educational game. It's just like multiplayer video games where every child has a differently colored cursor, and then they are competing to, for example, click on the letter of the Devanagari alphabet that they hear. We did very rigorous studies that basically showed that you could actually provide certain kinds of education to students in this way, in such a way that children would learn just as much 5-to-1 computer as they could on their own, 1-to-1. And so in effect, our conclusion was, so this is a use of technology which could conceivably reduce the per cost child of computing for the sake of education. And I'll give you an illustration of what this actually looks like in practice. So over here, you can see these children, they're literally climbing over each other to try to get control of this one mouse. This one child is about to discover the touchpad. And then this is a situation with one mouse per child. You can see there's a different expression. They're actually immersed in the game. They seem a little bit happier. And what happens if you were to watch this for several minutes is that in this situation, all these other kids eventually get bored and start leaving the computer. And then funnily, even the child with the mouse gets bored because now all of his classmates are no longer interacting with him. Whereas over here, the kids stay engaged for 20 minutes, 30 minutes at a time. And in fact, we had one child say, how come every computer doesn't come with multiple mice? Now, I'm a researcher. I thought, hey, this is great. We've done great research. Let's try to see if we can take this idea and spread it to other schools. And we tried to do this for at least 2 years with a range of different kinds of schools and institutions. And each time we found that there were many other problems that we kept facing, even to get to the point of being able to implement this idea in a school. In some places, the computers looked like this. They were either not functioning or extremely dusty and dirty, not used for months, if not years. In other cases, the administration decided that the computers were too valuable to let the kids actually use them, and so they were locked away in a closet. In other situations, the teachers were afraid that they didn't understand fully how to help the students use these computers, and they were afraid that the students were doing things that they themselves didn't understand. And we kept running into problem after problem after problem, which was not fundamentally about the technology, but ultimately didn't allow the potential value of the technology to express itself. Now, that is just one example where you can have a good technology, but there are a range of institutional challenges that prevent the potentially positive impact of that technology from being expressed. I'm going to talk, that's a relatively small kind of micro view of one project, but I'm going to now take a big step back and talk about the situation of education, in this case in the United States, in the context of education. So this graph shows various ways in which you can look at average SAT scores of college-bound secondary school students in the United States. And one thing you'll notice is that from the period of about first of all, let's go back. Let's go back to 1950s to about 1994. This red line at the bottom, that was the verbal score of students, started off relatively high, and then it went down, and then it stayed down. That staying down pattern is repeated in that red line above. That's also verbal scores. Apparently the test changed, and so there are two different lines. But it declined and then stayed at a very low level for basically until the present moment. Math scores did not show as strong a decline, but they actually have not improved that much over the last 40 or 50 years, right? So overall, the pattern is that, assuming that you believe SAT scores are a meaningful indication of some kind of education, we have either seen a decline in the educational average for this country, or we have not seen that much progress. Now, during the same 40 or 50 years where we have seen this kind of educational stagnation, we have had a dramatic rise in all kinds of technologies. And my guess is that many of us have heard all kinds of claims about how technology is going to improve education for our children. In many of our schools, technology is increasingly being used all across the curriculum. I was surprised to find, I have a 4-year-old son, but I was surprised to find that in first grade, students are now being required to be online so that they can download homework and so on. This is in the Ann Arbor public schools, school system. And so all kinds of things are happening in which we are increasingly pushing technology into the educational system with the underlying belief that it has value for learning, but that hasn't been quite true. Now, ultimately, I think education, as Swami Vivekananda apparently believed, education is ultimately not for the sake of learning. It is for the sake of becoming a better, more whole human being. So let's see how technology has actually impacted our ability to improve our own society. Okay, so this is the same kind of graph, except now I'm overlaying the rate of poverty in the United States on top of all the time when all of our technologies come. So again, if this graph were extended back to the 1940s, you see that poverty steadily declined in the United States until just about 1970, and then it has basically stayed flat since then, right? It has not budged, which is surprising for one of the world's wealthiest countries. Similarly, you might say, well, social media allows us to connect to each other. We are now connected to people that we don't otherwise know, connected to people whose beliefs we previously might not have understood. You know, this connection surely makes us understand each other better, empathize more with each other. That has not happened. If anything, it appears that we are now even further apart politically than we were several decades ago. Sometimes people tell me, oh, okay, what about those situations where you can now donate to various charitable causes? It's never been easier to donate. You can text to Haiti. You can, send through mobile payments. You can send money. Before we had to write a check, handwrite it, put it in an envelope, lick a stamp, take it to the post office, and so forth. Over the last 4 or 5 decades, the rate of charitable giving in the United States has really not changed that much as a percentage of GDP. It's basically held steady at about 2%. So all of this is to say that, that despite these incredible increases in better technology, and that technology has penetrated so that all of us now own smartphones and we're all using Facebook and we all have access to the internet, the world across various metrics has just not gotten that much better. In some cases, it's gotten worse. So this is, for example, our fossil fuel consumption over the last several decades. Global fossil fuel consumption. We all believe in sustainability. Surely with all this technology, we can be better at sustainability. That doesn't appear to be happening. So what does this mean? Well, first of all, I think it means that these very optimistic conceptions of what technology in and of itself is going to do for educational systems are just wrong. I do think that there are ways in which technology can be used in a positive way for education, but that is not what is generally being pushed when people talk about technology in education. I want to say a little bit about myself just so that you have a sense of the context of where I'm coming from. So of course, I'm a professor here. I teach in a very Western educational system. It is largely a secular educational system in which, although we often talk about building people who are better citizens, it doesn't talk that much about spiritual growth or personal growth in the sense outside of academic growth. I'm also a scientist by training, and almost everything I'm going to say in the remainder of this talk is also based on what I believe are relatively objective scientific facts and conclusions. At the same time, I'm very interested in trying to support all kinds of positive social change. So the work that I do is very much in the area of kind of social science, using technology, but understanding that in the end, there has to be some social component for positive change to happen. And then relevant for all of you, in my personal life, I am I would say an amateur practitioner of Rinzai Zen Buddhism. I used to, especially before when I was in my 20s and 30s, did a lot of meditation, often in very intensive retreats. And because of that, I also have some interest in Vedantic texts. And so I've read some of those, although I would certainly not class myself as by any means as an expert. So over the time that I was in India, I would say I probably either ran myself or oversaw some 50-odd different research projects. In every one of them, the goal was to use some kind of digital technology to support positive social change in education, healthcare, governance, agriculture, finance, and so on. And every one of those, we were able to run a relatively limited pilot in which there was some kind of positive outcome. And yet, in every one of those, every time we tried to take this to larger scale impact, we ran into all kinds of problems. I would say, in fact, out of those 50 projects, there's only one that continues to have positive impact. And some of that is due to the fact that we eventually spun off a nonprofit organization whose sole focus was that particular project. And so I want to try to bring the intuition that I now have about technology to you. And I believe it's intuition that most of you already have, but I want to try to draw it to the surface. So here's a first. This is an excerpt from a text in which I've intentionally taken out a particular technology and replaced it with a letter X. And what I'm going to do is ask you to see if you can guess what X is. Okay, so if you have any ideas, raise your hand, let me know. Anybody? Yes. Internet. Yeah. Computers. Laptop. Electricity. Cell phones. Technology, yeah. So it is some technology, but what specific technology? Television. Okay, great guesses. So I lied a little bit. These are actually excerpts from different claims that were previously made about different kinds of technology. The first one was about cinema, next one about radio, a third one about television, and then only the last one about computers. Next, I'm going to ask you to guess just roughly what decade in the 1900s were these claims made. So cinema, any guesses? 1930s, okay. Radio? 40s, television? 50s, computer? 60s, 70s. Okay, great guesses, all basically approximately correct. The first claim was made by Thomas Edison, inventor of the light bulb and the moving motion picture in the 20s, and you can see some other people making various claims. Now, looking back, right, for some of these claims look ridiculous. Like, you know, do we really believe now that television is going to be a particularly great thing for education? It turns out that in the 60s in particular, this was taken very seriously by the country. Congress allocated funding for certain public schools in the United States, especially those that were suffering from a deficiency of teachers, to basically use television as a primary means of education. You can see there's a photograph here where most of these kids are watching TV. There's a person on the side who is a teacher, but most of this time was taken up by watching television as opposed to actually having active lessons in class. Today, of course, we look back at television and we think, oh my gosh, why did we ever think this was a viable tool for education, right? You know, this is, at best, it is for entertainment. At best, it is for news, but it is not really an effective tool for education. So what I want to say, and that's been true of every one of these technologies. I have actually looked at literature that suggests that at some point people thought typewriters would be good for education, or overhead projectors would be good for education. And every time these new technologies have fundamentally failed to deliver on their promise. Many of them have been incorporated into our educational system, but they haven't made it dramatically better, right? Like, we don't now have, you know, 10 times as many Albert Einsteins as his generation just because we're using this technology. All right, next question. When you see a child with a smartphone, most frequently, what are they doing? Okay, so A, who believes A? Has anyone seen this happen? B, practicing mathematics. C, playing video games. Right, okay, good. So, you know, to me, this is really the best evidence of why we should be very suspect of claims that giving every child a computer is going to lead to better education. You know, children are, in fact, naturally curious and naturally inclined to learning, but they're also naturally inclined to want the sweet part of stimulation without the hard work. I think of a lot of the technology as being cognitive candy. Right? It is delivering the easy stimulation of blingy, you know, bright-colored animated objects without having you have to work to get that result. And as a result, what it's doing is it's bypassing all the potential learning and basically getting students and children hooked to the stimulus without the value of the underlying interaction that it might cause. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't good educational games. It just means that those are not the ones that children are playing. Right? They're playing the ones that give them the maximum stimulation for minimum effort. Now, it turns out that there is now, at this point, I would say very, very good research that demonstrates that simply handing a child a computing device does not cause them to learn anything more than children without those devices. Surprisingly, this literature also says that those kids aren't doing worse than all the other children, but they're definitely not learning more. And so if we're going to spend money on education, it seems like buying them technology is probably the wrong use of that funding. All right, next question. I'm going to ask this audience. Okay, when did you first learn to use a computer? So please raise your hand whenever I ask the question. So first of all, how many of you learned to use a computer when you were primary school age or younger? Okay, we have a few hands. Okay, how about secondary school age? Okay, a few more hands. In university? Okay, a few more hands. And at work? Okay, and never. Okay, at this audience, relatively, there are still some people. So I will say that, in this audience in particular, there was a distribution of people who learned to use computers at different ages. I'm at an age where I was not introduced to computers until I was well into high school. And even then, it was relatively cursory. But I don't think that I have fundamentally missed out on some kind of education that was required for me to have the life that I have now. If you're my age or older, which is about late 40s or older, that is likely a very similar situation. Now, the interesting thing is, how many people here have had to take a class to learn how to use Facebook? Okay, no, right? And why is that? It's because there's something about the education you received that was sufficient to learn to use the tools of technology, even though that technology did not even exist when you were going to school. And so what I want to emphasize is that arguments that suggest that if your kid doesn't learn about computing right now, they're going to be left behind, there's something flawed with that argument. It is true, obviously, I think that if you expect your child to become a computer programmer, probably relatively early exposure to computers will be a benefit. But if you're expecting your child to do whatever it is that they want to do, and they don't seem to be particularly excited about computer programming, and specifically, I would say a regular, good education that covers the fundamentals of good communication, good mathematics, good reading, etc., is far more essential than them learning how to use Facebook, or them learning how to create PowerPoint slides, or them using all of the tools that are here today. Another interesting thing about this is that by the time they graduate, the technology will be different anyway, right? So whatever advantages you think they're giving them now are going to have changed, and then there will be a new generation of technology they have to relearn in any case. One of the more interesting things these days is that increasingly wealthy parents with a good education are actually striving to find ways to keep technology out of their children's lives at a young age. There are Waldorf schools in Silicon Valley, for example, where all the parents are tech company executives, right? And they pay good money to go send their children to a school in which there is an outright ban on electronic technology until the 8th grade, and the school actually requests the parents to limit screen time at home as well, right? So parents are paying extra money to keep technology out of the hands of their children. There was a famous New York Times article in which the author who interviewed Steve Jobs frequently basically said that Steve Jobs did not buy technology for his own kids. Right? So we are increasingly living in an era where it's not just that we're not sure about the impact of technology, but the very people who know the most about technology are becoming suspect about it for their own children. All right, next question. Okay, what kind of school would you prefer to send your children? Please raise your hand for whichever one is the top answer for you. Okay, so a school with no teachers and many computers. Anybody? No, okay. Bad teachers and no computers. No, okay. Bad teachers and many computers. Great. Good teachers, no computers. Okay, some people. Okay, so I'm glad that some of my slides have already had an effect. Good teachers and some computers. Okay, a lot of hands. Good teachers and many computers. Okay, so I would say that if you believe that computing was the reason why your children are going to get a good education, then you should have selected one of these three, right? But everybody in this room selected one of these three. And the thing that's common in these three answers is the good teachers. And we all know this deep, deep in our hearts. And better educated parents especially know this. So this is a school in Seattle. It's called the Seattle Lakeside School. I once used to tutor there. I substitute tutored for a friend of mine who needed me to tutor for about a month. And this is a school that Bill Gates went to. It is extremely expensive. The school is very well resourced in terms of technology. And one of the interesting things I found was, but what the parents would pay me to do was to just spend time with their kids. And some of these kids needed actual help with mathematics and physics, which is what I was tutoring. Some of these kids just needed somebody to sit there and watch them do the homework. I mean, I did nothing. I was just enforcing them to do the homework, right? And the parents knew all of this, and this is the thing they were paying extra money for, above and beyond an already expensive tuition. And so what that tells you is that as parents, we understand deeply that the thing that matters in education is good adult supervision. And yet, when we talk about policies for other people's kids, we are quite happy to say, well, we can't afford teachers for them. Let's give them computers. And I think that is exactly what is happening in our country right now. Okay, last question. Okay, imagine you're the executive director of a for-profit corporation that has a good product but isn't meeting its sales goals, okay, and it's losing money. Which of the following is most likely to improve the situation? So this is forced choice. I'm going to ask you to pick what you think is the best answer. A, create a new strategy. Anybody? B, replace the leadership team. C, provide more training to employees. Or D, buy iPads for all of the employees. Okay, so you laugh again, and this seems ridiculous. And of course, if you think that's silly, then buying, having staff productivity software or AI features, artificial intelligence features, is also not likely to do it. And yet, I would claim that a lot of our social problems these days, the first solution that people want to jump to is, let's throw more technology at this problem. So for example, we believe we have an expensive healthcare system that's not serving everybody equally. Let's run with a lot of electronic healthcare records. Or we have a problem with our government. Let's make sure that the government has a transparency website where all of their data is open and so on and so forth. And the underlying problem with this is that the persistent social challenges that we have in our world are really human challenges. They are individual challenges. They're challenges with institutions. If you don't fix those problems, no amount of technology fundamentally turns things around. So just to summarize all of the things that I've asked you questions about, and these are, again, based on your answers, I believe you already intuitively know this. So one is that the history of educational technology has been disappointing. Research shows that more technology by itself does not improve education. Good education is possible without digital technology. And the most important thing in education is ultimately good adult supervision. And finally, technology by itself doesn't repair bad educational systems. So I'm, again, a scientist by training, and one of the things I really wanted to try to do is to see why do we keep having this illusion that technology is going to solve problems when it doesn't seem to do it in the ways that we want. And the best conclusion that I've been able to come to is a very simple idea, which is that for the most part, technology only amplifies underlying human forces. And so what does that mean? It means in those contexts where the human forces are positive and capable, you can actually use technology to have an even better outcome. But in those contexts where the underlying human forces are either dysfunctional or indifferent or possibly even corrupt, then no amount of well-designed technology actually turns that situation around. And amplification is, I will say, is not necessarily a bad thing. You can, all of us, my guess is, when we use technology, are generally putting it to an overall positive purpose. But I also say, knowing, just speaking from my own personal context, there are plenty of times when the technology is only causing me to do something, some bad habit is only being further amplified. And we have, both positive and negative in ourselves, and the technology is amplifying both. And at society at large, I think you're also seeing that. One reason why the Ann Arbor District Library does great things with technology is because their underlying institution as a whole is doing a great job. And so, again, the technology can lead to positive things. But as you heard from Josie, there are some contexts where you still have to be very vigilant because there's funny little places where human foibles still creep in and get amplified. I want to turn a little bit to a related but different topic, and that's one that is on many people's mind, and that is about fake news. I have colleagues who are trying to address the problem of things like fake news through technological means, right? They are computer scientists. They are trying to develop new machine learning and algorithmic ways in which to detect fake news so that they could conceivably be rooted out. But I claim that technology would be great to have, but it's not enough for the technology to be there. And here's one reason. So this was Mark Zuckerberg's original response when his company was accused of spreading misinformation and fake news. And he said, of all the content on Facebook, more than 99% of what people see is authentic. Only a very small amount is fake news and hoaxes. And so basically he was saying, I'm not responsible for fake news, right? And even this 99% figure is probably technically accurate because Facebook is mostly cat videos and people having breakfast. But that 1% that remains that was actual news, a significant percentage of that, other scholars have found that a significant percentage of that, somewhere between 10 and 30%, depending on how you estimate, was actually fake news, right? So that's a significant portion of the news that was on Facebook. Now, he did not want to accept this, right? He wanted to pretend this was not his company's fault. And one thing I will say at this point is that we have to be willing to be a little bit more suspicious of the companies behind the products that we love. Okay, so I use Facebook, but Facebook is not necessarily a positive company overall. So how many people here have seen this movie, science fiction movie called The Matrix? It's a 1999 movie, and in it, it's a dystopian science fiction movie in which there's an advanced technology that basically enslaves human beings, harvests their energy, and they do all this while plugging human beings into this illusory life that seems to be reasonably good, right? I'm going to claim, even though that was science fiction and set some 200 years in the future, I'm going to claim that that reality is actually here with us and much closer than we think. Because, for example, Facebook is an advanced technology that harvests our attention, all while feeding its shareholders, all while giving us the illusion of a pleasant social life. Right? So, and this, I don't mean to really pick on Facebook as such. I probably do. But other large tech companies are in the same business, which is they are in the business of maximizing your attention on their products because that's the way they make money, right? There's a common saying about in Silicon Valley, which is if the product is free, if the service is free, you are the product. If you believe you're the customer of Facebook, that is an illusion. You are basically providing the thing that Facebook sells to its advertisers, which is your valuable attention, right? Now, as long as a company that has this business model is in charge, then it is not the case that they are necessarily going to have humanity's best interests at heart. And so one of the interesting things, one of the reasons why Facebook ultimately decided to do something about fake news was because there was such an uproar in the rest of the country that went all the way up to Congress. So this is a quote from the New York Times. When the heat from American lawmakers regarding ads placed by Russian trolls on Facebook began to rise, Mr. Zuckerberg had no option to ignore it. And now that he's decided to do something about it, he can actually pay lots of software engineers to come up with good solutions to this particular problem, right? But if he was not willing to acknowledge the problem, it doesn't make a difference how much good technology there was. He would simply not use it. And this is the fundamental challenge with technology, which is there's no such thing as a good technology that everybody is forced to use. And so technology is not enough to cause the kind of positive changes we want to see in the world. Oftentimes, positive change requires human beings to change. So again, for the most part, technology only amplifies underlying human forces. I want to be clear that I'm not saying technology is evil. I tend to think of it as being relatively neutral from a moral perspective. I'm also not saying that technology can't be used for positive ends. I think there are plenty of examples where that happens. And I'm also not saying that any one of us in particular should necessarily be averse to technology. Sometimes parents get the impression that I'm saying, oh, you're not doing the right thing if you're allowing your children to use technology. I don't think that's true. However, you want to be very purposeful and deliberate about how you're making those decisions. One thing I am saying is that there is no such thing as a technology solution to a complex social problem. There simply is not. And for those of us who might be seeking that, it requires much more than technology. It often requires something altogether different from technology. All right, so what does this mean in terms of how we should think about what are the human forces? So people often ask me, okay, well that's great. What do you mean by the human forces? I believe ultimately that in order to help the world become a better place for everybody, we actually have to worry more about those human forces than any number of technologies. And this is the part where I found what Swami Atmagyanananda said to be very interesting, because I came up with something that's very similar, even though I'm not familiar with Swami Vivekananda's writings. By human forces, I basically mean three things. And I think all human virtue comes down to heart, mind, and will. So very similar to the three H's, right? Heart is exactly what you heard already, which is the positive intention to try to have impact on the world. It's compassion, it's altruism, it's thinking about the pain you might cause others. Mind is the judgment and intelligence to make good decisions. And will is the follow-through, and I would say it's very similar to hand in the previous three. So I'm going to show you exactly how this works with technology. Okay, so here's a person. They have heart, mind, and will. If they have all three of those things, it is like they are almost guaranteed to have positive impact, at least on the long long-term scale. As you heard already, we don't control everything in our lives, and so sometimes you're going to misstep even if you have all these three things. There's always luck involved. But on the whole, people with heart, mind, and will are going to have positive impact. Now, my claim is that you can't miss any one of these three components. Okay, so for example, let's think of somebody who's lacking heart. Okay, their impact is going to be negative or possibly neutral in the long term because their intentions are not positive on the whole. Or let's take somebody who has a lot of positive intention and strong willpower, but they're, frankly, they didn't get a good education and their judgment is very bad. This is what I think of as a classic case of the road to hell is paved with good intentions. You have good intentions, but you keep making bad decisions about how to implement them. Or finally, the person that has good heart and good mind, but doesn't have the willpower to follow through. I think of this as a couch potato. Okay. Now, what does technology do to the situation? So when I say technology amplifies underlying human forces, what I just mean is you add technology, and these eventual impacts just get amplified, right? So somebody who has all three of heart, mind, and will, if they use technology, they will often see their impact amplified. And this is what we like to believe technology is always doing. On the other hand, if you just give the technology to people who don't have heart, mind, and will, then either the impact is neutral again or negative. And there are increasingly, I think one of the positive things about the news recently is that we are increasingly recognizing the harm that technology can do, as well as some of the more nefarious forces behind technology. And then another interesting corollary of this is that the more powerful the technology is, the more amplification happens. And what I believe as far as that goes is that that also means that in an age in which we have powerful technologies, the initial conditions of who we are matter even more. Right? So in a world in which there's not much technology, if a bunch of people are somewhat indifferent or negatively inclined, there's only so much harm they can cause. But in a world of powerful technology, now every one of those potentially negative intentions could be magnified and cause great harm. And so we have to be even more concerned. One of the things that I find in this discussion is that in some sense, technology is the most external thing in our world. It is the end result of all of our inner intentions, but it's also so external that it's also the most visible. And many of us are drawn to that external visibility and the flashiness of the technology and imagine that by making changes up here, real change in the world can happen. But I think if there's one thing that I've learned through this process, it is that if you want to cause real lasting change, you want to get to the essence of things, and the essence starts inside of us. It starts internally to us. Now, in my secular scientific work, I don't talk too much about what is underlying our heart, mind, and will. I think that's for you to decide on your own. But I do think that the deeper you go into yourself to understand how you can change to become a better version of yourself, how I can change to become a better version of myself, then naturally what happens is our impact in the world becomes more positive. And then strangely, all of the technology that we are in touch with starts becoming more positive in its impact as well, because it's simply amplifying who we are. So, and then, of course, there's questions as to, is this all one universe, or is it dual or non-dual? I'll leave that to you. All right, so thank you. Just to summarize, technology amplifies underlying human forces. Technology by itself does not solve persistent social problems anywhere. Positive use of technology requires positive heart, mind, and will. And I do think that modern education is actually quite good at developing, especially certain aspects of mind, but that we are neglecting in our larger educational system heart and will. And so one of the things that I think groups like this do and are important for is that it gives us a way to help nurture our heart and will in a way that is also positive for all of us. I have a book about these ideas. It's called Geek Heresy. You should be able to find it at the library. Thank you. Next question.
You wanted to say something? Okay.
Thank you for that wonderful talk, Professor. I have had a long experience with students, school teachers, university students, and monastic students. And one thing I found everywhere, that curiosity is a powerful force, powerful motivator. Once you create enthusiasm for a subject which engages curiosity, and that leads to a payoff in terms of delight and happiness for that person. So it becomes self-perpetuating. And then you really don't have to do much. That person will find his or her way. But having known that, I don't know, how do you take it further in terms of systems, syllabus, schools? I mean, I'm asking you also because you're a scientist, you know science, you know technology, and you know students from schools in India to elite schools to elite universities. So how do you ignite that, and how do you systematize it?
I'm trying to figure that out for my 4-year-old son as well, so I can't say I have the answer. I do think that that the right habits of mind being inculcated as early as possible makes a huge difference. Like, I speak to a lot of parents who say, but technology, my son doesn't use technology in those ways. Shouldn't I give them technology? And I say, that's true, but your son had the great benefit of having you as a parent, and you made sure that they're not just going to watch videos on their devices and so on, and that you somehow nurtured that sense of curiosity first. Yeah, I mean, I think the reality, and this is also increasingly being confirmed by various social sciences, is that the education that happens when the child is youngest is what matters most and which carries through. And so oftentimes, by the age of 6, 7, 8, or 9, children have habits of mind that will carry them through the rest of their lives, and including how they interact with technology. And one of the biggest challenges I think we're facing right now in the United States is that this idea that technology is good for children has now permeated most of our society. And now what's happened is that better educated parents are recognizing the potential harm of the technology and pulling back. But now there's an entire generation of parents who thinks that giving their kid an iPad and letting them play with it without any supervision is a good way to raise their child. And that is now causing what I think of as a reverse digital divide, where the technology, there's not a digital divide in the technology, but there's a digital divide in how parents allow their children to use the technology. Yeah, I mean, as far as the deeper question that you're asking, I don't have easy answers. I wrestle with these questions myself with my son. We're hoping that he'll learn to play the violin, but he hates to practice. I don't know what combination of bribery and cajoling and scolding and encouraging is the right way to do it, but every day is an experiment. That works during the lesson, yeah. But on the other days, when I have to be the one to try to get him to practice, yeah, that doesn't seem to be enough. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm a retired teacher in the inner city due to burnout, and
thank you for your service.
What the kids need is relationships and also exposure to nature. I'm just commenting. Sorry, I don't have questions. I already have your book, but. In Finland, they have shown great educational gains. It's very, very impressive. The children aren't even taught to read until I think they're 7 years old.
That's right.
Yeah. So that's all. Thank you so much.
Absolutely, thank you, and thank you for all of your work as a teacher. I personally believe teachers are, in fact, the most important profession in the world. I agree with Swami Vivekananda that if you give every child a good education, that's pretty much all you have to do. You can then step back. So Finnish schools consistently do very well in these international comparisons of education. This PISA test is one that the OECD runs, which is considered quite good in terms of not just being about superficial facts. And the Finnish school system is amazing in various contexts. One of the things that I think is a reason for that is that underlying culture values teachers. They pay them reasonably well, and they give them, the individual teachers, a lot of autonomy to teach the way they believe their children will benefit.
Yeah, this is Ravi Anupindi. I'm a faculty in the business school. One comment on Swamiji's question, and then a question to you. Swamiji, you asked about the curiosity thing. I was reminded, I keep going back to India, and in a small town, in a local school, I was asked to give a talk, and I was talking about various things, but including the need to develop curiosity. I was completely stunned by a little kid asking me a question. How do you develop curiosity? And as I reflected on it, what occurred to me is, so my wife is a Montessori school teacher, and the Montessori method is to create an environment to nurture that curiosity. I think somewhere along the way what happens is we as adults kill that curiosity in the kid. And so we have to be, and it goes back to the people issue you're talking about, whether adults meaning not just parents, but teachers, because kid naturally asks this question, why? And after a while, as parents, we get fed up because we don't have an answer, right? So we said, shut up, I mean, especially in India, they might say. I think there is something there, so Swamiji, I don't know, whatever it's worth. I find that I think we have to really work extra hard to keep that curiosity alive in a child. Otherwise, we lose them at some point. To your question, I've been actually read the book. I've been meaning to meet with you for the last 2 years. So great to see you here. When you talked about the amplification with more powerful technology, if you kind of extrapolate that to the current talk about AI, automation, machine learning, in some sense taking the human out of the equation completely. There's a lot of talk about that, but would like to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think of these more powerful technologies as simply more powerful technologies. In some sense, I think AI over time will become like the equivalent of atomic weapons, whereas all the digital technology we're playing now could be considered toy guns. And you're right that at some point this technology might become sufficiently autonomous that it would be easier to just analyze them as separate agents with free will that are making decisions independent of human beings. But until that moment, and I think we're still quite a bit a ways from that moment, the reality is we still have the power over whether a machine is running or not. We can always turn the machines off. We can always unplug. And so what that means is these powerful technologies are now amplifying the underlying forces in our society, which I believe are, at the global level, are certain kinds of political and economic forces that are tending towards greater economic inequality. Very likely the most sophisticated AI systems will be developed by large tech companies that we already know today. And those companies do not have the good of humanity in mind, despite their marketing departments. They are primarily concerned with increasing profit. And so until the rest of the world comes to understand that and believes that a significant amount of regulation needs to happen, we are basically going to, I think, see a world in which there's increasing amounts of economic inequality exactly because of this technology. And along the way, we'll see lots of other kinds of negative things being amplified. And there's already plenty of examples of how advanced technology causes even more problems than we've had in the past.
Thank you so much for your talk. I really appreciate your spirit, and I appreciate you bringing information in a way that can really change society and some illusions that people are having. In the interest of just bringing another side, I just wanted to bring a couple things forward. One, I once had a very positive experience with online graduate education. Now, my all-time favorite of ways to communicate is in-person dialogue circles. But I found that in online education, if an instructor was wise enough to ask the right question and allow people to respond, even if it wasn't done in real time, it did allow for great thought to be given with the answers. One of the disadvantages of in-person education, particularly in elementary school, is sometimes the teacher asking a question and the students who are the quickest to raise their hands or the most aggressive even, get the attention, and those that think a little more deeply, a little more slowly, they're forgotten. And sometimes, so there actually was that seems to be one place where technology could work if it's coupled with a dialogue circle kind of approach. The other thing I just wanted to see what you thought about. I once convened a dialogue circle with native elders and Western scientists on the subject of science, technology, and creativity. And we intentionally made it an intergenerational circle. And there was quite a bit of difference in the way that younger people were responding to the questions than those of a certain age, as I'm sure you would expect. One of the native elders, who's now passed, now grandfather Leonce Kentaro, what he said was that it seemed like the children being born now were being born with a computer mind, that they understood it had already been imprinted upon the morphogenetic memory of the human species, something about technology, so that those who are being born seem to build on those that came before them. That's why they take to it so easily. So I guess my question for you is, what do you think is the relationship between science, technology, and creativity? And how do you think young people, how do you think young people would answer that question differently than those of middle age or older?
Thank you. So let me separate those two questions. So the first question about online courses. Many of you may have heard about what are called massive open online courses, or MOOCs. Some of you may have taken them. In the early days of that, just 5 or 6 years ago, people used to say, hey, now we can basically deliver a college education to anybody with internet access. And thanks to our public library system, anybody in the United States pretty much has internet access today, even though it might be differentially convenient for different people. But since then, those exact companies that have really been pushing online courses have kept a lot of data, and what they find is that of the people who take these courses and who actually complete them, the vast majority are usually college-educated professionals with jobs, and often white men, incidentally, not busy working mothers working 2 jobs who would love to have a better education, or even jobless high school dropouts. And so, then the question becomes, what exactly is happening? Well, it's definitely true that there's some things you can do online in terms of learning that are definitely easier or better than you would in person. But a lot of education is about the social pressure to actually do things like complete problem sets, or read a book, or to write an essay, because you're feeling the direct pressure of the faculty member or your peers or whatever. And people know this, right? So what happens online is you start doing it, and as soon as you hit a bit of a challenge or you run out of time, you're like, oh, okay, I'll just get back to it later, and then you never come back to it later. And that happens more to exactly the people who don't have good study habits, who don't have a solid foundational education, and so on. And so this is another situation where amplification is happening. Basically, online courses are allowing the educational rich to get educationally even richer, whereas other people are not getting the kind of human supervision that is really important for education. I agree with you, though, that there are lots of ways in which you can use technology to support different categories of students, and with enough instructor intent on doing those things, and I have colleagues who use a lot of technology in their classrooms, they intentionally design the experience in a way to help, for example, students who might be too shy to speak up otherwise in class, and things like that, and it definitely helps them. But again, that's based on amplifying that faculty member's intention as well as the student's intention. Basically anybody who's coming to the University of Michigan has a pretty strong motivation to make sure that their tuition dollars are being well spent. Whereas again, if it seems free and you don't have any social pressure, it's much easier to skip the education. To your second question about generational differences, so one thing I'm always careful about is that every generation thinks that the new younger generation is crazy and is going to probably end the world, right? There's a famous story about how Socrates believed that the invention of writing and reading was actually a bad thing because it would cause everybody to forget, large amounts of epic poetry that they could carry around in their heads. And he was right about that, but I would say on the whole, we have probably benefited from writing. I can't say for sure whether the current situation with technology for kids is necessarily going to be good or bad. As I mentioned, the current literature on this suggests that students are actually not harmed educationally by having computers, although increasingly it looks like they might be harmed in their mental health through too much exposure to social media and increasingly not being able to have like real human one-to-one interactions. There's a national trend right now over the last 5 or 6 years where mental health problems on college campuses are skyrocketing. It's really quite dramatic and frankly quite scary. And some people believe that some of that is probably not entirely due to technology, but some of it is due to the fact that we are now raising a generation of students who, who believe that the primary way to interact with people is doing this, right? And so that's a little bit scary. But I'm also, I believe very much in human resilience, and that eventually we find our way through these things, and hopefully we'll find the right way to incorporate technology into society rather than just assuming that all technology is always good. Thank you, though. Great question.
I'm still formulating the question in my mind, but along the side of that curiosity for the kids and what Swamiji started with, or is there a study? Is the curiosity of particular subject or topic or whatever, expertise, is that intrinsic or born in the kids, or is it something pushed by parents? Because I try to push the piano lessons to my kids and they haven't become any good in piano or anything. But on the other hand, Swamiji, he went on Vedanta study, or we have Steve Jobs or Bill Gates and all those people. What exactly happens and how one becomes in one area? Is it intrinsic, born, or is it something we are doing or not doing?
To the best of my knowledge, modern science does not have a great answer to that question yet. I think my guess is that we underestimate the degree to which minor things that we do actually contribute to our children's quirks, right? At the same time, I also think there's a genetic influence. There doesn't seem to be any doubt that one of the things that a lot of my female peers have found is that as much as they try to raise a gender-neutral, neutral child, their girls want princess dresses and their boys want to play with guns. And it's not that they have tried to, inculcate that. So there's some very complex interplay between genetics and environment that I think, modern science is not anywhere near fully understanding. There's all kinds of anecdotes. People have all kinds of hunches, but yeah, it's still. I think of the positive side of that, it's still a great adventure to be a parent. If we could figure this out, then it would be a pretty boring task. We're like, okay, we know what to do. Let's just do this thing.
Oh, yeah. I got a question for you, but first I'd like to answer hers. I think it's both extrinsic and intrinsic, because for me, when I was growing up, my mom used to always read to me, and then after that, I love reading. And from reading so much, I developed interest in many different topics. So it started off extrinsic and it became intrinsic. So I think it's both.
I think that's, by the way, I think that's very true, which is a lot of things that are intrinsic when we're older were due to very good extrinsic environment, from your parents,
So my question is, do you think, well, I guess since last century or since recent time, do you think technology is mainly created, or new technology is mainly created for profit?
Yeah, I think in the way that our current world order is constructed, the technology that survives is based on profit. One of the things, again, among a lot of my peers, there are people who believe that if we just invented the right technology, everything would be better. And I think the